Thank you. Welcome back, everybody, to the Little Less Fear podcast. I'd like to introduce Zoe Kors. She's a sex and intimacy coach and the author of a new book called Radical Intimacy: Cultivate the Deeply Connected Relationships You Desire and Deserve, which I do desire and deserve. She is the resident sex and intimacy coach at sexual wellness app Coral and the host of the Radical Intimacy podcast, which I hope and can't wait to be a guest of. Welcome to the Little Less Fear podcast, Zoe.
Oh, thank you, Lino. Thank you, Dr. Lino. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, so we've been missing each other for a couple months now. We finally got in touch.
I know it's been a little bit. I've been in a whirlwind of book launch. So thank you for your patience with me.
So tell us about your book launch. Of course, you're welcome. Thank you.
So I have been working in this field of as a sex and intimacy coach for about a decade, a little more than a decade. And one of the things that I have sort of been passionate about in my own life, and then also really see in my clients, is this craving for like a deeper connection with the people in their lives, and a sort of more profound experience of life. And so I've kind of over the years named that as intimacy. And through my own relationships and my own practice, I have a sort of a history of studying and practicing Tantra and also Zen Buddhism. I've sort of, explored intimacy in terms of my own being and my own relationships. And then through working with clients, I sort of developed a model of intimacy, if you will. And I've called it radical intimacy. And then when the pandemic hit, I just decided this is it. I'm taking the extra time and the extra sort of energy and ability to focus, and I'm channeling it into a book. So,
Zoe, how do you define intimacy?
mm, So I define three kinds of intimacy and three levels of intimacy. So the three kinds of intimacy that I define are emotional, physical, and what I call energetic. And
Wow.
the three levels of intimacy are self, other, and world.
Okay.
So if you grid those out like a bingo card almost, with the three kinds: emotional, physical, energetic across the top,
Yes.
and self, other, world up the left side,
Okay.
you grid it all out,
I see
and
it.
then
Yeah, it makes sense.
you end up with like 9 areas of opportunity to
Wow.
cultivate intimacy. So
That's
physical intimacy with self, physical intimacy with other, physical intimacy with the world, and then the same for emotional and energetic.
that's very in depth, more in depth than I've ever heard before, actually. And
Mm.
is this something that you came up yourself after seeing so many clients? Is it something that you discovered yourself?
A little bit of both, right? So I'm sort of my own laboratory in a way. And of course, me being just one representative in one kind of body, having grown up in one kind of culture, I'm just a sampling of all of humanity. But this particular way of looking at ourselves in the context of our own being, and then our sort of immediate relationships, and then global relationships and our relationship to the planet, it sort of seems like a universal framework for me. So yeah, I mean, some of it was, again, like my own relationships, and I tell a lot of personal stories in the book. One of the reasons why I decided to be a coach, and I'm certified and credentialed as a coach. One of the reasons why I wanted to do that rather than become a licensed therapist was because I could share my own stories. So so I tell a lot of stories in the book of my own sexless marriage in my 20s, and a relationship with someone where he was incredibly intimate. In fact, that was his sort of pursuit um, of intimacy, is sort of how he proposed that we sort of run our relationship. And so he was incredibly intimate, physically and energetically, but not emotionally, completely emotionally unavailable to me, largely because he was unavailable to himself.
Makes sense.
So that enabled me to start to draw those distinctions, like, wait a minute, how can this be so, how can he be so present? How can we be so intimate? And then, and then I don't really have any clue about his emotional landscape, because neither does he. So what is that? What is that distinction there? Because it's not just physical. There's this other thing happening here. So once I was able to kind of break that out and really sit with it and sort of grit it out, I started to look at the way people relate to each other, and particularly in my work with couples, having that piece, that the recognition of a certain level of presence or consciousness or intimacy and connection that happens outside of the utility of speech and touch.
Yes.
And we have felt that, in like shared experiences, right?
Right.
Think about, cooking dinner with someone where
Mhm.
you're not really getting to know somebody's life values. You don't know what they think about something. You're not necessarily touching them. It's not an emotional experience, but it's certainly a connective, intimate
It
experience.
is. It definitely is.
So that's energy. That's an energetic intimacy that's happening there.
So what did you discover after you realized that there was that emotional energy that was missing with this is your ex, is it your current husband or your
Oh
ex-husband?
no. And it was somebody that I was with for about 8 months.
Oh, okay. Well, with somebody that you dated. So then I'm assuming that you realized that was somebody that was not compatible with you. And
Yes, that's correct.
were you able to communicate that to him at the time, let him know that there was like an emotional um intimacy that was
Yes,
not there?
although he lost interest in me as well because I challenged him too much, like I would just being with me, I think he could feel the incompatibility because he didn't want to face his feelings too much, and I wasn't willing to just gloss over it,
Mm-hmm.
so he would get angry at me. He would become enraged,
Mm-hmm.
really, over things that he couldn't even really point to. Like he would react to something that I said, or something in my tone of voice, or something that offended him, that he perceived to be critical or something. And when I questioned him about it or tried to sort of talk through it, he couldn't handle that.
Oh.
I have I I have two dogs. I don't know if you can hear
No,
them.
no worries about that at all. And so in your book, Radical Intimacy, how could you define just the word radical intimacy, and how are those two words, how do they come hand in hand?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. When I started using the term radical intimacy, it was sort of my answer to this common perception that intimacy is simple, that intimacy is sex. Actually, we conflate those terms,
Yeah,
intimacy
that's
and
why I asked you how you define
right.
it, because that's how most people define intimacy.
Yeah. And I think we use intimacy as a euphemism, when we want to be polite or safe for work or whatever, we just sort of slip that in there and
Yeah.
people go, hmm. Um, but intimacy, when I work with couples and dig around with, what they're craving and what they're missing, and I will often hear one member of a couple say, I want to have more sex, and the other member says, I want more intimacy, right? So there is this other thing about intimacy that feels like a connection. It feels deep, and people will point to emotions because that's kind of what people are oriented towards. I'm either feeling something or I'm touching something.
Hmm.
So when I started to really sort of blow up this idea of intimacy as something more fractal, more complex, more dimensional, I started to feel like it's sort of like it's radical, it's in every aspect of our lives, and we can have a deeply connected experience of ourselves and each other and the world, and that's intimacy, and that's a radical idea, you know. It's a
It is.
radical idea to take the idea of like what's happening in Ukraine, or what's happening with Black people, or what's happening with trans people, or and to really feel an intimacy, feel a connection with people other than ourselves, you know, like
Right.
a broad swath of the population. But that's what I feel like we need.
I agree with you 100% there. You know, something that as you're talking, some thoughts are coming to my head, and I'm thinking about the emotional intimate, the physical intimacy, and the energetic intimacy. I also thought I wonder where spirituality would, if there's an intimacy with spirituality in your book. Because as you were saying that, I was thinking, you know what, my biggest intimacy, but the most intimate part of my life right now is my connection to spirit. And I feel like I meditate so often, and I can't wait to meditate. Even I turn on my candles and I make things sensual. I put oils on, essential oils, and I feel a really strong intimate connection with spirit and myself. And is there room for that in your book?
Yeah, you're speaking my language.
Oh, excellent. Oh,
Yeah.
great. Wonderful.
Yes, and I kind of what I sort of chalk that up to is an energetic intimacy. You know, I think for people who I wanted to write a book for people who have no interest in sitting on a meditation cushion or a yoga mat or whatever, um, but really slowing down, silence, being able to sit into the emptiness or the mystery or whatever language you use to describe the unknown, you know,
Yes.
that place of like where we stop and the universe begins, you know, that sort of like the oneness of all. um that is really, and that really has informed my work all along. When I first started studying tantra, I don't know, about 15 years ago, I um I felt as though I had come home. I had come home to myself, and like the sort of combination of I'm the former senior editor of LA Yoga magazine, so
That's
I'm a
awesome.
longtime yoga practitioner, and I
That's
used to
incredible.
say like I want to have sex the way I do yoga. Like I want to feel that way at the end of a yoga class. That's how I want to feel when I'm having sex, or, you know, or chanting mantras or kirtan um or zazen, you know, like it's that sort of sex can be a form of prayer, as can any form of intimacy, you know, that sort of that deep connection beyond what we think we know.
Yes, it could be very meditative as well. Having, wow, that's is that how you would describe for our listeners that don't know what tantra is? How could you explain and describe what tantra is?
Yeah, tundra is a hard thing
I
to
know it is.
sort of
It is.
summarize, but
It really is. Yes.
tantra is, and most people have heard of tantra because back in the 80s or 90s, Sting did an interview, and he happened to be drunk at the time and made a joke, an offhanded comment about having tantric sex. And so then everybody was like, tantric sex, what is that? What is that? Um, and at the time he had never had tantric sex, actually. I think afterwards, in the aftermath of that interview, he and Trudy started to explore that. But tantra is there are many different sort of lineages and schools of thought with tantra. Tantra is basically a form of Hinduism. um, Many people um, in India consider tantra to be like Hindu paganism, where it's much less formalized and and a little bit wild and esoteric and not necessarily sort of cleaned up. Um, and so it's really a philosophy and a perspective of seeing the world that incorporates everything, you know, shadow to light, as divine. And that includes sexuality, and it includes, it's like everything in us. There's no separation from the divine to what's happening right here. It's
Mhm,
all one. And so sex becomes literally a form of worship or devotion and
mhm,
prayer. And so that has been taken, like you will see a lot in this country, in the United States. You'll see a lot of what's called neo tantra, which takes a lot of the sexual practices, which is often sort of like a little bit like a high level of sensual awareness, very slow, extended periods of arousal, an exploration of masculine and feminine energies, and kind of takes all of the mysticism out of it,
mhm.
and just uses those sexual practices as a sort of form of uh, wellness and sex practice, sexual wellness. Um, the tantra that I studied was very esoteric, very out there, and very sort of as philosophical as anything else. Um, so very deep.
And so how do you incorporate that tantra with intimacy?
Mm. It's a good question. And I really made a very conscious decision at one point that I was not going to, there was a fork in the road. Am I going to be a tantra teacher, or am I going to um, be
In-
a
Intimacy
sexologist
expert.
and a
Yeah.
sex coach and an intimacy coach in a much more mainstream, accessible way?
Mhm,
And I chose that path. Everything that I do and everything I know about our bodies and sexuality and the potential for relationship really leans heavily into Tantra and what I learned from Tantra.
mhm.
When I started studying with Salma Zadora, I don't know if some people out there may have heard of her. She's no longer alive, but she was a very controversial Tantra teacher. And practicing with her and studying with her really changed my life. So I take those things, that awareness that I gained from working with her, and really set out to make that accessible to everybody. Like, you don't have to be chanting Sanskrit mantras to experience what I experienced. That's one way.
Yeah.
And that's a way that just I sort of stumbled into. But it doesn't have to be like that. That level of awareness and embodiment and ease and self-expression can happen in any context.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about your book. The rest of the title of it is Radical Intimacy: Cultivate the Deeply Connected Relationships You Deserve and Desire. Is that correct? Desire
Yes,
and deserve.
yes.
So how does one start to begin to cultivate something deep? Is that through having sessions with you? Is that through somebody getting more in contact with their higher self? I mean, well, what is that composed of? What does that look like?
Um, it can look like many different things to many people. I think I really wrote the book so that people could start to get an idea of how to go about getting more connected in their lives. And really, one of the big takeaways from the book, I think, is that we can only meet each other to the extent that we can meet ourselves,
Right.
right?
Yes.
If we want art and are craving that kind of deep connection, to be seen and held, and to see and hold the other people in our lives, we have to be able to know what it is that we're sharing. We
Right.
have to be able to say, here's this piece of me, here's what's happening inside of me, here's what I'm struggling with, here's what I'm celebrating. And so often in this culture, we are so busy, go, 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 and sort of skimming the surface of our lives. And so first and foremost, I think the book, one aspect of the book is how to really connect with yourself, how to be really honest with yourself. I talk about the trifecta of anti-intimacy.
Oh, wow.
is denial, deflection, and distraction,
Oh, wow.
and ways in which we sort of deny that there's something going
The three
on.
Ds, huh?
Yeah. There's like, we deny, we deny everything's fine, I'm good, I'm all right, and not just to other people but to ourselves. I'm a master at this. I had cancer when I was 20 and when I was at university, um I yeah, it was hard and there were definitely some emotional moments, but I was a trooper and I was busy surviving, and then afterwards, I moved on, and well, now I'm in my 50s, 30 years later, and there's some fallout there from having been so tough and not having processed a lot of that trauma
Mhm.
of having had cancer and gone through treatment at 20. So, that aspect of like, it's all good, I'm just chugging along, we're just surviving here. Like, there's an aspect of um denial that is serving to separate us from ourselves.
Yes.
We also get really good at deflection. So, my husband likes to say about couples, he also coaches couples. And he will often say, like, it's never about the dishes. Like, we make it about the dishes, or we make it about the laundry, or we make it about something, but it's really not, actually. And sometimes it's
It's so
something,
true. It's so
right?
true. Yeah.
Sometimes it's like in something in the relationship. Sometimes it has nothing to even do with the relationship.
Right.
There's times when I know he's stressed out about something and he'll say something in a way that I sort of bristle. And I have to just say, like, oh yeah, right. Like, he didn't sleep last night. My husband's a terrible sleeper. And if he's tired, I have to just let things roll off my back,
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
but so we deflect, we get mad about something, and I tell stories and give examples of this in the book, some really like crazy ones of what people get mad at, instead of really looking at what's actually
At the
happening,
root.
which you're in denial of, right? Because you're
Yeah.
gaslighting yourself.
Right. Amen.
Right.
Yes.
um and then distraction. We all have our version of, a gallon of Ben and Jerry's on the sofa with binge fest.
Yes,
So
definitely.
so those are the ways, those are the ways in which we sort of like put up roadblocks to intimacy. So, and that happens with ourselves first and foremost, and then with our people.
I can't imagine how difficult it must be to have clients who have never really experienced intimacy in any of these levels in their life.
Yeah.
Where do you start then? How do you start then?
Yeah, I think by the time people come to me, um, I think that a good number of them have actually been in therapy.
Okay.
Um, a good number of them have been in therapy. They've done some amount of
So
work,
there's some awareness going on.
some awareness going on, and then, I mean, some of them. I taught for many years at a yoga festival, Bhakti Fest, and so I did a lot of coaching with people who are like on a very dedicated spiritual path. So, and I still, believe it or not, that festival hasn't been running since about a year before the pandemic. So,
Mhm.
so that's several years, and I still have people coming through my door that are sort of connected in those circles. Um, but what happens with couples in particular, even if I'm coaching one member of a couple and they're coming to me for some kind of suffering that's going on in their sex life, they've usually been in therapy and their therapist can't really address the sexuality aspect because they're not trained to. So that's when they reach out to me, which is at some point sort of fine tuning.
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
And there are people that I refer out to a therapist.
Yes.
There are people, if someone is not awake and aware enough to be able to actually take action, then they're not a good coaching candidate. Then they need, if they're really like stuck in something that is stopping them and they're unaware of what it is that's holding them back, that's a job for a therapist,
Oh, yes, definitely.
right?
Well, this sounds like fun what you do.
It can be. It can be heartbreaking. It can be gut wrenching. It's really vulnerable work, you know?
Yeah. And but the wonderful thing is that you're able to talk about your own personal experiences, and that always helps people open up when you do that.
Yes, yes. And I mean, my sessions really are about my clients, but Dr. Lino, it's so helpful to normalize people's pain, you know,
Yes, definitely.
to really to let them know that they're not alone, you know,
Right.
and whether it's me and my story or a client's story of you know, like overcoming this kind of hardship and this kind of pain is really, it gives a great context to the work.
What's the biggest takeaway from your book? What do you want people to know? What's the biggest thing you want people to know? You can
Yeah,
answer both questions or one or the other.
yeah, thank you. I feel like I always have a different answer for this, but I'm going to say this here with you, and that is that we have a certain narrative of sex and sexuality and that relationship with ourselves and that sort of part of human existence, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so off base and so screwed up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's really based in um, white male patriarchy, and that is rooted in sort of in an ancient religious context that
Mm-hmm.
is not applicable to sovereignty, agency, freedom, self-expression, authenticity, identity. And I just, you know, whoever you are, whatever body parts you have, whatever pronouns you have, whatever the color of your skin, no matter the shape of your body, you are um you are allowed to feel pleasure, to express yourself, to have sex with whoever you want to have sex with. You know, as long as it's consensual and as long as nobody's getting hurt. That's one of the great joys of life. So
Yeah, I'm
the
sure we choose to incarnate because that's
yeah,
probably one of the reasons why we're like, I'm coming back as a human.
yeah, I mean, look, we get to, you know, we each come from sex. That's how
Yeah,
human beings are made. It's life affirming.
right.
It's joyous. It's, you know, it's celebratory. It's divine. It's sacred. It's amazing. It's like, you know,
And stress
and
relieving.
yes, yes, it's physically, it's healthy for you. It's a wellness practice, you know. You brush your teeth, you self-pleasure, you know, it's just, it's like, and so the idea that there's shame, that there's guilt, that we're doing something wrong or that we should do it a certain way, our miraculous bodies are an opportunity to step into a pleasure laboratory, either solo or with a partner, or more than one partner, if that's what you choose, and to really experience the fullness of being alive.
I love how you said that, a pleasure laboratory. That's amazing. I love that. Zoe Kors, everybody, how can our viewers, our watchers, and our listeners find you? And how can we find your book?
Yeah, well, so the book is Radical Intimacy, and it's available wherever you buy books. It's a major publisher, so it's easy for bookstores to order it if they don't already have it on the shelf. You can get it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, or if you like to support independent bookstores online, bookshop.org. The Radical Intimacy podcast is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. And the hub of all things Zoe is zoekors.com. ZOEKORS.com.
Zoe Kors, everybody, what a pleasure. What awesome person, human being you are. Thank you so much for being on the Little Less Fear podcast. And I'm certain we will keep in touch. Thank you for all
Yeah,
of your valuable information. I really appreciate it.
thank you. It's my privilege. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you.